Your stories don't define you, but how you tell them will. Hi, I'm Sarah Elkins, your host and chief story maker at Elkins Consulting. If you've listened to these episodes before, you know I call myself a story maker because I know that when I pay attention to the world around me and I'm intentional about my actions, my behavior, my words, I make stories every day. Stories that can be inspiring and motivating, stories that can be really good opportunities for learning. And today, you are in luck, listeners. You're going to hear a conversation between me and a woman named Lisa Weiss. We met because I found her new podcast, The Object Diaries, and I immediately felt compelled to listen. The very first episode is her recording with her father, walking him through some objects, found objects from his youth. And if you are anything like me, there's a sentimentality about that just made me tear up. And that may be partly sensitive to, I lost my father 10 years ago, February of 2014, and I never recorded a conversation like that with him. So it was almost a found memory for me because I could imagine the same conversation with my father. Lisa, I am so eager to get started in our conversation today. So thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me and for that warm and kind introduction. Thank you.
Well, it reminded me of listening to This American Life and the other story shows that I've listened to over the years on NPR and now on podcasts. It was so well produced. The links between the present tense and the past, the transitions that you included, the music, everything was so intentional in that episode that I felt completely compelled to reach out to you. So thank you for the efforts you put into this podcast, because I know it's going to make a huge difference in people's lives.
Thank you. Thank you. It was a labor of love for sure. And really, the credit for the production goes to the producers that worked with me, April Estrelon, and Jessica Terrell. Jessica Terrell had a vision for how we were going to put the pieces together, and April added her talent and skill and musical abilities to really score it and make it feel really personal and intimate. So, because it was really hard to tell a story about my father, I was too close to it. So I
Right.
really needed, this was an instance where I really needed an outside perspective to help me. So we worked on it together, and they really helped me kind of get a little bit of distance, but not too much, so that I could tell
Right.
a story that other people would find interesting. So
Ah, well, it worked. It worked so well. And now, of course, I'm compelled every time a new episode comes out. So that's it worked. I would love to. So I normally start by asking people to share something about themselves that most people don't know. But this week's episode, it feels different to me. So I have a different question to you. What was the compelling factor in creating this show? Like what was the story that you thought, "Oh my gosh, this has to happen. I need to build this."
in many ways, it was a lifelong calling, I think, from childhood, growing up and sitting down with my father when he showed me his little box of toys, cigar box filled with little toys. And I realized, because he wasn't a person who shared openly his thoughts or feelings, he, when he would sit down with me and show me this little cigar box that he had from childhood, filled with these little trinkets that he'd held on to, I started to understand more about who he was just from a very early age. Some of my earliest memories, it's all sort of blurs in a way, these moments of him showing me his toys. But I realized that objects unlock something in me and in other people too. So I realized that it unlocked something in my father. Whenever he showed me his toys, I saw this different side of him, this intimacy that I wasn't as familiar with. We didn't have these sorts of interactions. He started to tell me stories about his life and his childhood and his family. And I understood what mattered to him in a way that I didn't understand without having these moments. So I think in that early age, it was rooted in me that objects mattered to me. I've always been drawn to certain objects. I've always collected things, held on to things that other people have given me. And I look at them, I think of the person, and it holds a lot of power for me. So I think I just reached a certain point in my life, and certainly having lost my father when he died of cancer in 2023, I was already working on this project. I had recorded him many years before, but it was a calling to always work on this. So I think I hit a point in my life where I couldn't not do it. I had to do it. I realized I didn't want to live an unlived life.
Mm. Yes. That's one of the conversations I have with my clients a lot is what are you going to regret not doing? And that's actually one of my favorite quotes. It's a Mae West quote. I only regret the things I didn't do. Oh, I
I
love
definitely
that.
resonate with that. And I feel that, my father didn't have a lot of opportunities growing up. And the opportunities that he had, he mostly made for himself. He provided me a lot more opportunities. I was able to go to college. I was able to do a lot of things. I was able to study English literature. That was not a practical choice. My father
Mhm.
never had the opportunity to make an impractical choice. And so any skills or talents or artistic endeavors that would have interested him, he really never had the opportunity to explore. And so I had this privilege that I could because of the sacrifices he made that allowed me to do things that he never could have. I'm sure he would have loved to have made a podcast and told stories, but he couldn't. And so for me, it was definitely something I didn't want to regret. I really wanted to do it and take the opportunity. So he never
So,
got to hear this. He never got to hear,
no,
yeah, the final product, but he knew I had recorded him and he knew that I valued his stories.
uh, I love that. I keep coming back to this idea of objects as an opportunity to open conversation. And I love that you are doing these networking events. I think I saw it called networking for introverts or something. And this idea that people will bring along an object, you specifically in this one that I saw promoted was to bring an object that was prior to Y2K. So anything before the year 2000, which of course instantly makes me think of cassette tapes and other items like a standard phone or a cordless phone that was not cellular. And I love this idea for a couple of reasons. One is I do a lot of public speaking coaching, and it's not just people who actually want to get up in front of people. Most of them don't. The idea is to develop more comfort in those environments where either you're at a meeting and they're asking you to speak up and your anxiety just gets the best of you and you feel this bubbling coming up through your chest and the acid reflux starts to hit, your hands get sweaty, right? Or if you hear the word networking and it makes you want to vomit, right? A little in your throat. Those are a lot of the people that I end up working with. And the idea that you can start with an object. I I didn't realize that even in my book, I recommend being intensely observant of what people are wearing. So it could be a pair of earrings that you notice. It could be one of my favorites is to notice fur baby, so pet fur on their clothes because I'm a dog person. I love dogs, but I love fur babies in general. So to be able to see somebody with pet hair on their leg or on their arm or shoulder, and I can say, oh, you bring yours along wherever you go too. And it's always a great conversation starter. So hearing your idea just really resonated with me.
First of all, I love that idea that looking for pet hair on someone's clothes when we're anyone who is a pet owner. So we have a dog and a cat, and I've always had pets. So I'm always self-conscious about removing any signs of fur so I don't look sloppy. But to think that it could potentially give someone else comfort or give them something to find commonality in, that that she also loves her animals, her fur babies, right? That's a beautiful
Yeah.
thing. No, I find that especially for introverts, I tend to identify as an introvert. I'm a bit of an ambivert, and I certainly can play as an extrovert because I've
Mhm.
had to. And but I think that I always needed a comfort object. I was somebody who had a little stuffed animal as a kid.
Mhm.
I would bring a doll when I had to go somewhere. That my childhood pictures, the family pictures that we have, I was usually holding a doll or something that mattered to me because I always
Mhm.
needed that little bit of comfort to feel at home in my own skin when I was sort of around people, I think. And so I think that it's not a crutch, it's an opportunity. So it's a point of connection. It does provide some psychological, I think, some safety for people that
For
maybe feel a
sure.
little uncomfortable, and it allows you to think of something outside yourself, because if you tend to get in your own head and it, or you find it very awkward to talk about yourself with other people, it's nice to have
Hmm.
sort of a touchstone of something that you can hold and point to that's outside yourself. And when you're telling a story about that thing, you're also telling a story about yourself, but it takes the
Yes.
spotlight off of you a bit, gives you a little bit of
Hmm.
comfort.
There's so much here. This is such a rich topic, really, because so many of us right now more than ever are having a hard time connecting. So when you think about the guests that you have on your show, what are you looking for? Because it's a pretty significant shift from the first episode to the second episode in terms of who you interviewed and what their object was. So how are you finding this, and what are you really what's your goal at the end of each podcast?
Yeah, I was looking for someone who has an object with a story of depth. So it's not just, oh, this is, my favorite pen, unless it has a story, which we have one in my family that crossed on the Queen Mary. So there can be a story about a deep story about a pen, but it tends to be the story has to have depth and layers. So it has to be not just an ordinary everyday object that you care about, but something that unlocks a deeper story and tends to be a bit of a secret object. So something that you don't always talk about. It might be a bit hidden. The object's hidden. And I personally have several of these, and many of us do have several objects like this that unlock deep stories that point to other people too, because
Mm,
these are not materialistic objects. This
right.
isn't a story about the value of the object. It's about the value that the object represents in a relationship. So it points to meaningful relationships and a life journey that we're on. So I originally found the first person that I interviewed was a woman named Gabrielle, who she wrote me a letter after I'd sent just an email out to a bunch of friends and acquaintances and colleagues, and hoping that this idea could resonate. I wrote a little letter that said, if you know anyone who has a story, a meaningful story about an object that means a lot to them. And I just sent it out into the world, hoping that something
I
might
love that.
forward. Just not
Right.
sure
Well,
because
it's also an experiment for listeners. Is this going to resonate with people to be able to put it out there? It's almost like market testing in some ways.
right. And I just knew I wanted to do this. This was probably 6 years ago when I first sent out this email, somewhere around there. And I wanted to just get a sense of whether this is something that other people cared about. And so
Mhm.
I very quickly got this response back from Gabrielle. And Gabrielle told me about this. She wrote me a beautiful letter about a journal that meant a lot to her. And that for me just solidified that I was onto something. And so I knew that I had to tell her, work with her to tell her story. And she's an incredible storyteller. So that's sort of how it began. And then
Mhm.
we're really exploring how it will evolve moving forward. But I tell people about it. I tell people about the project, and they've told me when I say I'm working on a project about meaningful objects, then people have told me, oh, you could talk to this person. You could talk to this person. And that's actually how it happened that I found Imran, who is featured in another episode, because my friend Wendy said you should talk to Imran. And so it really just
Yes.
it sparked something in people, and they came back to me with ideas. So
One of the things that happened as I was listening to the first couple of episodes is I was thinking about my objects, of course. And that's ultimately, as far as I could see from the perspective of a podcaster myself, what I assumed was the purpose of this was to get people thinking about their objects and their meaning. And because of what you said a moment ago about how it's more than just an object, there's a story, and not just a story, right? Something that's really meaningful brings other people into it. And when I first started thinking about this, I immediately looked up at this big copper mixing bowl that came from my father-in-law, who passed away in 2013, I think. And I remember when my husband Bob got it, he said, "This is the bowl my dad always made hot cross buns in." And I don't have any story beyond that for that bowl. And both of our boys know that it was Pop Pop's bowl. So I know it will continue. This isn't a bowl that's going to disappear because nobody knows the sentimental value of it. But what you said made me think that's not really the same, because I don't necessarily have a story behind it, why it's important other than that sentimental value. The next thing you said about the pen, that triggered a completely different feeling for me. I was thinking about the pen that we got when my husband and I eloped 2 weeks before our actual wedding, so that the rabbi who was coming from LA to Washington, D.C. wouldn't have to get any kind of license to perform a marriage in Northern Virginia at the location where we were getting married. So we eloped, didn't tell anybody. And I still have that pen, even though, of course, it doesn't write almost 30 years later. This was in 1997, but it says I, and then hyphen Mary, Mary hyphen U. Y O, no, I think it's just a U. And I had it in the visor of my car for like 20 years. It may even still be in there. I think I might just move it every time we move to a different car, or I replace the visor pocket where the registration is. I think it moves with it. So, what is one of your objects? Because clearly, I mean, I think you mentioned one in one of the episodes or in an introduction, but you must have an object like that that you didn't realize had a story behind it until you started exploring this podcast idea. Is
I
there
have
anything
so
like that?
many. I have so many objects, and I will tell you about one or two of them. But I love your story about Pop Pop's copper
Oh,
bowl, and it's interesting because it can be a sort of a touchstone for the story, because why did he know how did he learn how to make hot cross buns? And was he the family baker? Who had the bowl before him? Did he was what did they taste like? Who liked his hot cross buns? Did your husband taste them? There's so many questions. And one of the difficult parts is that when people are no longer with us, we can't ask some of those questions
right.
anymore. And that's one of
Right.
the hardest parts about the toys that belong to my dad, or the copper bowl, because we have questions. I have some memories around them, but we have questions. And so that's why I think it's so important for us to think about the objects that matter to us, because if we want the next generation to know these stories and to keep any of these items and pass them on, it helps when they know a deeper story that exists around the object. And we can't
Yes.
bring back the past, right? But we can at least think about our own objects and the stories that we have around them. So I have, and I want my children to know why these objects matter to me, because I have to be realistic. Someday I will be gone, and I don't want some of these objects to be thrown away. I'd like for them to have value for my kids as well. So
Right.
I do want to tell them the stories and preserve the stories in whatever way, whether it's on paper or audio, or I just tell them verbally and they remember the stories. But yeah, I have the story. I would say that the objects that matter most to me are the objects that belonged to someone else, like my father's toys, which I still don't have. They're with my mother. I I think I just it's hard for me to imagine them being mine. So
Right.
I haven't been able to take them, even
Well,
though I know that
it's
they
still
hold.
so fresh.
It's
It's
still so
still so
fresh.
fresh.
It's
Yeah.
it's he died in April 2024, 2023, so it's been a year and a half, but I just can't possess those, but those are the most important objects to me. And then I have other objects I surround myself with on my desk that just remind me of people that I care about. And I have a shell. I'm just, it sits on my desk and I'm holding it in my hand. I think I was around 8 or 9 years old. I was on a vacation in Florida with just my parents. I have a sister and she was away at a camp. And so I had special time with both of my parents, and which I'm a younger child. I have an older sister. And so for me, having special time with my parents was not something I had experienced a lot of. And it happened to have also been my birthday. And so I remember just swimming in a pool and having them watch me. And it,
I have two kids, so I can totally see that. And
I
I'm the middle of three. So,
just having all eyes on me for a minute,
right.
just felt so luxurious and special. And it was my birthday. And so we went into a little a shop that sold shells. And they bought me this beautiful shell. It's sort of a conical shell, iridescent mother of pearl. There's a name for this shell, but it's a nice size. It's not small. So it was, I mean, I think it was $10 at the time, but that was expensive. This was, probably 1984 or something like that.
Mhm.
And that was my birthday gift. And so I remember these moments. I tend to like objects that make me feel like I matter to someone else. That's what I tend to gravitate towards. And
I love that.
this one reminds me of that, makes me feel good.
I,
So,
I love that because I guess I have that similar feeling. I have this um, precious moments figurine, and I've never been a tchotchke person. I am not a person that collects things like this. It's way too cute. And being as petite as I am, the word cute was like, I hated that word growing up. I just wanted to be sophisticated or beautiful or anything but cute. And I would say from the time I was little up until my mid to late 30s, I would say cute is for baby ducks. Don't call a woman cute. Right. So I'd get really annoyed by it. But this Precious Moments it was called Amelia Bearheart because it was a little bear in an airplane on a spring that moved with a little cloud that it was attached to. And it was from my friend since second grade, my only friend that stayed around that long because we moved around a lot. And I still have that thing. And she gave it to me when I graduated from college, which at the time was like, what are you giving me this little trinket? Like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do with this? I'm moving. I had 10 different addresses between the time I graduated high school and the time I got and 28 years old, I had 10 different addresses. So I moved that thing all over the place. But I still have it because it makes me think of her and because she got that for me because she saw me as being so adventurous. So when I look at that, I think, that's right. I'm an adventurer. It
Absolutely.
reminds me of a piece of myself, right?
Yeah, a part that you want to be reminded of. I don't
Yes.
surround myself with objects that I don't want. I don't only keep objects that spark joy. I keep, this is something I feel strongly about, that we shouldn't only keep the objects that spark joy. I think that you can value other emotions, but I particularly surround myself with the objects that remind me of who I am and what matters to me versus, right, like I love this idea of your Amelia Earhart nod to
Isn't that
Amelia
just so cute?
Earhart. It's yeah, right. And I won't call it cute. It's inspiring, it's meaningful, and it's also touching that a friend saw that. And when a friend or a person sees something in you
Yes.
and an object can represent that, that's really beautiful.
I
So
can see you have one of those. Show
yeah,
me. Show
yeah, well, I
me.
have another one. I have another one that this is just a little pig. I don't know if I told you about this one, but this is actually a replica. I always forget that it's a replica of one that I received. Now, sometimes we lose objects and I mourn them, ones that matter to me that were from someone I care about. So when I was a little girl, my grandfather, who was sort of my champion in life, he always supported me, thought I was good at things that I really wasn't good at, but he just thought everything I did was impressive and that I was good at everything. And when I was little, I loved pigs. And so I just loved them. I thought they were so cute, especially piglets. So he gave me, one day, he gave me a little tiny pink ceramic piglet that his friend Beverly,
Oh,
who's a sort of amateur ceramicist, but very talented, had made. And it's a little sleeping pink pig. And he had opened up his hand. It was closed inside his palm, and then he opened it, revealing this pig. And I just will never forget the moment when he presented me this pig, because he had had it specifically made just for me by his friend. He knew I liked pigs, and he was thoughtful enough to give me something to think of me in this way. And so I treasured it. This was, I probably had it for, I mean, just decades. But then it disappeared one day. I'd kept it in my mother and father's home, and it just disappeared. The pig, and I don't know, someone broke it, but nobody ever told me who. And
they figured you wouldn't miss it after all these years,
right, but of course
right?
I did, and I was
Of course.
so sad. And I mean, I didn't actively mourn it, but I
Right.
did something I missed.
Right. You still think about it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because it was something from my grandfather who was an important figure in my life. And so I decided one day that I would just look for something similar. And so kind of looked at eBay and Etsy, and I check it over the years. I kind of look to see if I could find a sleeping, I'd Google pink ceramic sleeping pig, small. And then I found it looks exactly like my pig, but I know it's not the same one because mine had a signature on the bottom that said Beverly, and it
Uh-huh.
doesn't. But I wouldn't be surprised if Beverly made this but didn't sign it, because it's the exact same size, shape, everything. The way it is built is exactly the same. So I think of it as the same. But yeah, so this is something that reminds me of my grandfather, and I keep it on my desk.
I love that. And I love that you have that vivid memory of receiving. I think many of us kind of lose that part of the story, the moment in time. I can tell you that as a storytelling coach, and I've had this podcast, we have over 350 episodes of this podcast, and I've been pulling threads of stories from people for years and years now. And some people have a really hard time telling a specific moment in time story. So I love that you have this vivid memory of him holding that pig in his hand and then opening it for you to see. And I'm imagining this old hand, right? This is not a child's hand. This isn't even your parents' hand. The age of it, I think, is part of that vivid memory. So when you think about that, when you are guiding people to pull these threads, you already started with me when you asked me questions about that copper bowl. And the first thing was the reason I remember it this story because I didn't spend a ton of time with my father-in-law before we moved to Montana. And then he died. And of course, I haven't had any time to ask questions about that since then. But what I remember vividly was when the first time I made challah, the Jewish braided bread for the Sabbath, I made challah in that bowl. And then the next day, I used dough that I had cut off and I made sticky buns. And this is the first time I had done that with challah dough, and they were amazing. And I remember my husband saying, these are better than my dad's hot cross buns. So that's part of why I remember that copper bowl and the story behind it.
I love that. And that's a great story, how you're continuing the tradition. And I think sensory memories tend to unlock a lot. So my grandfather liked to tell stories. He wrote poems, but I think just even the way that he presented the little pink pig had a dramatic element to it, and that made it
Yes.
memorable. So that he did a an unveiling of it. You know, he didn't just hand it to me. There was, and that's part of what wrapping and bows and wrapping paper and bows can do too. It's some of that experience. It seems silly. It's not great for the environment, but you can do it with your hand too. And but just sort of the reveal is exciting and can be memorable because it has this sensory quality to it. There's a hand, as you said, you're describing it. It's an older man's hand that opened up and revealed the pig. And so yeah, I try to when I try to pull the threads, as you say, of a story, I definitely tap into the sensory memories. Like, what does the dough feel like when you're making the hot cross bun or making the the
The
roll
challah dough, right.
rolls, and so that sort of thing. Like, what did it smell like? And you can bring back memories through that too. And the more that we're present and pay attention in the moment when we're interacting with something, the more likely we're going to remember those scents and those feelings and the
Do you
sound.
have any episodes where you have that um, kind of a more vivid memory of the interview itself and how you were able to navigate those questions? Because I know when I first started my podcast, sometimes I had a hard time um, not pushing beyond what the person was ready to share. I had a particular episode that is very vivid in my memory where I learned a lot because this woman reached out to me afterward in love and friendship and said, this went wrong and here's why. Do you have any memories like that in your in I know you've recorded a few episodes so far.
Yeah. Let me think. I memories of how I pulled information out or how I handled it. Or I mean, I do remember, for example, when I interviewed Imran, I just remember it was during COVID the first time I interviewed him, and it was really challenging because he had to wear a mask. And I remember being really concerned. And so that's seared in my memory, just the fact that he had to wear a mask because we met in person at the local Chicago Public Library. And it was just him and me. And I wasn't an expert at recording audio in the field. And so I remember feeling, is this going to be fully usable? Am I going to have to ask him? And I was also so nervous about getting him sick if I, for any reason, had, you know, COVID and didn't know it. And so that seared into my memory. And I think I got nervous because of just the fears of getting sick or getting someone else sick, even more so. And so I did probably I had to ask some of the questions again and interview him again another time because of that. So but I really
Mm.
wanted to get it done at that time, but it was really stressful because of the fact that, we had to wear masks and be really careful. And I was sort of doing research at the time, trying to figure out, is there a way that a mask can act as sort of a filter in audio, sort of a
Right.
pop
Is
filter that you would use in front of a microphone. So, and in fact,
yes.
it was. So the audio was not terrible. It was usable, and we did use some of it. But I think more so it was my own sort of trepidation and discomfort with the situation that kept me from asking the best questions at the time.
Oh,
So
that is so important. What a critical lesson right there is that your the condition that you were in, your emotional place made it harder for you to be able to do what you needed to do in that interview.
absolutely, it did.
Well, and I think it's partly because what you're doing is so personal. It's so vulnerable, both on your side and on the person that you're interviewing. So your emotional state really does contribute a lot to what you're doing.
It does. And I think that also to your point about sometimes, you don't want to go too far, but you also want to go far enough, right? So sometimes we can risk that, and it's good that you had that conversation with your guest afterwards, that open conversation. But I think, yeah, you don't want to not go far enough, right? And I think there's a better way for me to say that. But sometimes we don't ask the real question. Sometimes we skirt
Right.
an issue and don't go there. And that does the subject a disservice too. So you have to ask sometimes the hard questions. You have to push. You have to you have to go there, right? And sometimes
Mhm.
that can mean going a little too far, but we can always scale back. You can always, but yeah, you don't want to be so safe that you don't ask a meaningful question.
Oh,
So
that is so true. That is so true. Have you, in your interviews, gotten a response that surprised you, caught you off guard, made you weep? I mean, what's one of those that is vivid in your memory?
I think, well, Imran's episode. So Imran is a Rohingya refugee. So he's from a region of Myanmar where he's not recognized as a citizen. So he's stateless. And I went into the interview with one conception of what his object would be. So Imran has this incredible story. He grew up not being able to read or write. He couldn't go to school because he was stateless. He wasn't recognized as a citizen of the country. And so he didn't know how to read or write, had never read a book, had never written. He could, speak in his language, but is just an amazing story of being detained two different times, in once in Indonesia and once offshore of Australia. And he wrote a book. Remarkably, he taught himself to read. He taught himself how to write by interacting with guards in detention centers. And so he ended up writing a book about his life, which was just an incredible journey, going from someone who wasn't allowed to read or write and then writing a book. And so I went into the interview believing that that was his object, because my stories were about the object that matters most to you. And I made an assumption. And I had even spoken to him before our interview, and I thought that was going to be the object, was his book. And that was really important to him. And it was pivotal in his life and the transformation that his life went through. But ultimately, the object that mattered most to him was a document showing his refugee status that was ultimately granted to him, that protected him. So that was the object that mattered the most to him. And I didn't know that. And of course, it makes so much sense, because he was somebody who never had, he actually never had a passport. He never had a driver's license, anything to show that he was a citizen of any country. And so for him, that ended up being the most important thing. The book that he wrote
Mm.
was also important, but it was always paper that was the most important thing. So I think that it's just memorable to me not to assume, not to put
Yes.
my ideas or my assumptions on someone else's story.
And
And
I'm guessing that he didn't know that you had done that because you just flowed with it, right?
right, exactly. Right. And I thought, I was sort of setting it up in a way, asking questions, thinking he would answer that it was the book that he wrote. But, and that was really important to him. But he made it clear throughout that it became very clear to me that that what he really valued the most was his paper showing refugee status. So
Wow.
Yeah, so I learned a lot from that experience and to actually listen because when you go into an interview, you want to prepare and you want to think about if I ask this, they might say this, right? If I ask this, they might say this, or I hope they will. But you also have to listen and follow the flow of what someone actually says because it can lead to something much better, which is that's exactly what it ended up being. I could have told
Mhm.
a story, it wouldn't have been inaccurate that the book mattered a lot to him that he wrote because it did. It's just that the other object mattered more.
Oh, so you really hit the nail on the head right there, is that no matter how much you prepare, no matter what you anticipate, listening is the real value in coming to the place where you're going to make the most meaningful story.
I think so. And that's what everyone really wants is to be heard and to recognize that you actually heard what they said. So that for me is a big part of the project too, is that I hope that the people I talk to feel like I listened to them and fully
Mhm.
understood them and didn't put my ideas on their story, that I really was a partner holding their hand so that they could tell their story. So, yeah, because
Mhm.
listening, I think, is the key to so much. And if we don't listen to each other, we really can't connect genuinely. So,
Mm. Mm. That's like the perfect spot to bring it full circle to the beginning of our conversation. And this whole idea that your goal for this is to hold space for people to not just find the object, but to understand the deeper story behind it, to be able to share that and inspire other people, or at the least, so that we start to discern more about that person, more depth than we can get just from asking leading questions. Oh, I love
absolutely.
that.
Yeah, I want people, my goal, I think it's just something I've struggled with in my own life of feeling like you matter.
Mhm.
And so that's part of why I think some of us collect too many objects or try to be, or materialistic, to have the house and the car and all the things to say, look, I matter. I'm important. Look, I have a fancy car. Oh, I have a nice house. I have nice clothes. I have a nice handbag, the latest iPhone, whatever. It's a way to say that you matter, to say, I'm important. Don't overlook me. I'm not invisible.
Mhm.
I want you to see me. But these completely worthless, essentially objects to me matter more, right? They're
Mhm.
the things that say who you are and tell a story about you. And I think really all that we really want is to matter to someone else. And so
Mhm.
that can be really hard. And so we're trying to sometimes have a lot of proof, right? By gathering all these things, there's a lot of proof
Mhm.
that you matter.
Yeah.
But just a reminder that it doesn't take that, that just the simplest things can be leaving your
Mm.
mark.
Mm.
Like the word matter, a physical thing is filled with matter, right?
Right. It's energy.
So as I level, it's energy, right? And it's a way to say, I was here, right? I have this thing, I'm leaving a mark. And so, but really what we really want to do is just be important to other people,
Mm.
I think.
Agreed. That's perfect.
Be useful, right? Be
Be
someone that
relevant.
be relevant, provide a service, be useful. Yeah. I
Thank
think
you.
that's what a lot of us want. So
Agreed. Lisa, thank you so much for this time. It has, I knew it was going to be wonderful. I didn't know exactly what to expect because I never do. But this was really wonderful. And if our listeners want to follow you, listeners, just so you know, all of Lisa's links will be in the show notes associated with this podcast episode at elkinsconsulting.com. Is there anything you want to leave the audience with?
just think about the objects that matter to you and write it down if you can. Write a little story about why that object matters and put it in a place that you remember so that others can look at it and so that you can look at it. Write a little story, just a few lines will do, but think about those objects that matter to you. Thank you.
Perfect.
Thank you for this conversation.
Listeners, it's your turn. One of the first topics in this conversation was about considering the depth of the object that you're holding on to. So, what is an object in your life that you can look at and tell a story about that includes other people, other characters in your story matter? How can you share that with people? Think about opportunities to use objects to connect with the people around you. Because right now, in our global community with the polarization we're experiencing, this is so critical. Asking a question not to change somebody's mind, not to try to persuade somebody, but asking them with the intention of connecting. Tell me about your shoes. Tell me about the baby spit up I see on your shoulder. Ask the question that will bring depth and connection to that moment in time. Thank you so much for listening to Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Tell Them Will.
That's the time you must keep on trying. Smile, what's the use of crying? You'll find that life is still worthwhile if you just smile.